In 1964, Bob Dylan predicted that a hard rain would fall. He wrote a song that contained many apocalyptic lyrics and strange images that he saw a black branch with blood that kept bleeding, a young woman whose body kept burning, and a highway of diamonds with nobody on it. In many ways, that song predicted what the rest of the decade would be like, and a hard rain did fall. Today we're going to cover the 1960s, which I which is where we see the high watermark of Cold War liberalism, but also we see its undoing. Liberalism was in high tide, and it was the mainstream of American politics. And as we will see, in 1964, 1965, 1966, it passed major legislation after major legislation. But by the end of the decade, and in the early 70s, the hope that marked the beginning of the decade turned into disillusionment, and America was almost as divided as it was during the Civil War. Now, our memory of the 1960s, much like the decade itself, is very divided, and largely that comes from how recent it is and how political the memory can be. The 1960s was a decade of progress and chaos. You have Cold War liberalism, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. It was full of contradictions. It was strictly anti-communist, but it also supported ending poverty and ending segregation in the South. And Cold War liberalism was very moderate compared to what many other activists were calling for. Now, one of the main Cold War liberal figures of the time period would be John F. Kennedy. And when he was was elected with this hope that he could get many programs passed through Congress, many liberal programs passed through Congress, and also contain communism. But people became disillusioned with both Kennedy and his successor, Johnson. And Johnson was more of a Cold War liberal than Kennedy, I would argue. The critiques of Cold War liberalism came from both the left and the right. Now we'll talk more about the new left and counterculture later. But it critiqued liberalism for its contradictions, for being too pro-war and not doing enough to end poverty and not doing enough to end segregation. Conservatism took the opposite approach. Now, in the 1960s, conservatism was practically politically dead. Now, Eisenhower, yes, he was a Republican, but he wasn't a conservative. He was a moderate Republican. But in the 1960s, this youth movement appears that supports conservatism. And Nixon, who is a rather moderate conservative, he is elected by the end of the decade, and he wins in a landslide in 1972. And the ball gets rolling in the 1960s for the conservative movement that comes to characterize the 1980s with the election of Reagan. And that's largely because of this young people's movement. When we think of young student protests, we always think of, in the 1960s, we always think of these very progressive and liberal protests, what the new left. But we also see the Young Americans for Freedom, or YAF, who founded, um, who argued for conservatism and began popularizing it. And they were concerned about the growth of the federal government, that it was getting too big, and they supported the war in Vietnam. And they were, and that movement, people, stalwarts from that movement come to characterize the conservative movement of the 1980s later on. More on conservatism later, too. We're going to go back to Cold War liberalism. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson is the quintessential Cold War liberal. Prior to becoming president, he served as a senator from Texas. He came from very humble roots. He was a political insider. He was known for doing these backhand deals and being able to persuade people to vote a certain way. He would get, now he was a tall man. He was 6'2". He would, what he would do is when he would be talking with you, he would always look down upon you, give you what was known as the Johnson treatment, using his height as a political tactic to get people to vote his way. And in many ways, he was the opposite of JFK. JFK and LBJ, they represent kind of the two sides of Cold War liberalism. JFK is the very charismatic, good-looking president, the politician. Well, LBJ is the man who, well, gets things done, and he represents kind of the underside. And I think liberals today aspire to look like JFK, but work like LBJ. So Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president from JFK's assassination, and he didn't like the way he became president. He wished he would have got it through the normal means, but he used the opportunity to pass all of Kennedy's legislation proposals through Congress. Congress had been essentially deadlocked throughout the beginning during Kennedy's administration. It didn't pass the progressive ideal proposals that Kennedy had proposed, his New Frontier proposals. Johnson, using Kennedy's assassination, pushes these through Congress, and this includes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the first programs of the War on Poverty. However, going into the 1964 election, he begins to distinguish himself from JFK, and he does so by coming up with the Great Society. Now, the election of 1964, even though it doesn't look notable because it's a landslide, it is very notable. So, Johnson crushes his Republican opponent, Barry Goldwater. But what's notable about Goldwater was he ran as a conservative. He was from Arizona, but he opposed civil rights legislation. He opposed the expansion of the federal government. He was very anti-communist. And that youth movement, the Young Americans for Freedom, were heavy supporters of Goldwater. His campaign, his main campaign slogan was, "In his heart, you know he's right." And he'll also say that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. However, Johnson portrayed Goldwater as an extremism, especially on foreign policy, where he portrayed Goldwater as this person who was too nuke happy, and that he would get us into the Vietnam War and never out of it. And it's ironic because Johnson is the president who gets us stuck in the Vietnam War. But he's famous for the Daisy campaign ad, which showed a little girl counting the leaves of a daisy, and then all of a sudden a nuke is dropped. And it says, the stakes are too high. Vote for Johnson this November. A highly controversial campaign ad, and one of the most famous. And in response, Johnson campaign also said, in your guts, you know he's nuts. But, despite being walloped in the national election, the Goldwater campaign shows the first cracks of the New Deal coalition and of Cold War liberalism. Barry Goldwater carries the South, and that is the first time the South voted Republican since actually, no, that is the first time the South voted, well, since Reconstruction. And also, one of the supporters of Goldwater begins to throw his name into politics, and his name is Ronald Reagan. Now back to Johnson. Johnson is famous for the Great Society, and the Great Society was this it was like the New Deal. This massive program package that Johnson passed in 1964 and 1965 and 1966. It is the last time that social policy or domestic policy was passed in such a great number. We haven't seen the likes of it since. With civil rights, as I said earlier, passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But he also passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which sent protections for African Americans in southern states for them to vote. The 24th Amendment also got rid of poll taxes. As far as social welfare goes, he passed the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which created the Office of Economic Opportunity, which administered war on poverty programs such as Head Start, the Job Corps, and Volunteers in Service to America, also known as VISTA. He passed the Medical Care Act in 1965, which created Medicaid and Medicare, two policies that still exist today and are widely acclaimed. He passed the Minimum Wage Act of 1966, which raised hourly minimum wage from $125 to $140. In education, he passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Acts of 1965, which granted federal aid for the education of poor children. He also passed the National Endowment he created the National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities, which you still see today, created the public broadcast system. The Higher Education Act of 1965 created federal scholarships for post-secondary education. Housing and Urban Development, which created mass transit for poor people living in the cities, also created public fundings for public housing and rent subsidies, created the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Also included in the Great Society were environmental protections, such as the Wilderness Preservation Act of 1964, which designated 9.1 million acres of federal lands as wilderness areas. And the Air and Quality Acts in 1965 sought tougher air quality standards and water quality and the enforcement of water quality standards. Also included within the Great Society includes tax reductions. That was one of the key parts of liberalism too, was also lowering taxes and providing bigger tax cuts for small businesses. The Immigration Act, which reversed the quotas that were set in 1924, and the Appalachian Regional Development Act, which provided funding for roads, health clinics, and other public works in Appalachia. Um, well, also one that I didn't include on this slide would be food stamp programs too. However, the record of the Great Society is checkered at best. Now, although there were some accomplishments, it did lower the national poverty rate from 20% to 13%, and black poverty dropped from 65% to 30%. Uh, some things were left out of the Great Society. Um, Conservatives attacked the Great Society on the right. They claimed it made the federal government way too big, and also charged that the poverty rates dropped because of economic growth. Now, people on the left critiqued the Great Society because it left too many people behind. Uh, this is actually my personal research. In 1968, people were starving in the Mississippi Delta. Um, there were certain areas that were just left behind from the Great Society. You had to buy vouchers for the food stamp program, meaning you had to have money to buy food stamps, which really hurt some people in these poverty programs. Now, one of the main problems also with the Great Society is that it didn't attack the core problems that cause poverty. So during the 1930s, Democrats attributed poverty to an imbalance of economic power and flawed economic institutions. In the 1960s, however, um, Democrats attributed poverty to an absence of skills and a lack of proper attitudes and work habits. And that is what the War on Poverty tried to fix, was to give people skills and give people the right attitudes. And it also did not take into consideration economic change that were reducing the number of well-paid manufacturing jobs and leaving poor families in rural areas like Appalachia and the Mississippi Delta, and also decaying urban ghettos, with little hope of economic advancement. So, like mechanization, which was taking jobs away from many people, that was not addressed by the Great Society, and we are still dealing with the impacts of going to a service-based economy. And that happens more throughout the 1970s. Now, the Vietnam War uh, the Vietnam War was extremely unpopular, but not at first. And one of the reasons why it was unpopular is that it killed the Great Society, according to many of the Vietnam War protesters. Uh, Typically, the money that was going to be spent for these programs that were created by the Great Society went to Vietnam instead. Now, the New Left, which is what we typically think of when we think of Vietnam War protesters, were student activists largely. Um, the main organization for the New Left, or at least what is kind of like it is what is credited for starting it, are the Students for a Democratic Society, which were created in 1962 at Port Huron, Michigan, and they released the Port Huron statement, which expressed a disillusionment that many young people had from Cold War liberalism. They were mad at the government for not doing enough to reduce the threat of nuclear war. They were mad at the government for not doing enough with civil rights. And they were mad at the government for not being democratic enough. And the New Left expressed largely the ideal for democratizing all aspects of society. Now, the New Left is associated with student protest movements, and these happened all across the country at various campuses. The first notable one was the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964, where they organized a sit-in at the administration building. Typically, campuses were viewed as they had this policy known as in locis parentis, which meant that they were viewed as the parents of these students and treating them very in a very patronizing way. As students had no say in the workings of their universities, so students protested and they demanded a voice to be heard in all the policies that the campus was making. Other student protests occurred at Madison, Wisconsin, for instance. Those protests were usually linked with the Vietnam War. And these protests were typically there were different facets of the protest. There were the teach-ins where you'd find a professor sympathetic to the cause, and they would teach pretty much all night, going past university closing hours, and teach about topics such as the Vietnam War or the war on poverty. There would also be sit-ins at administrative buildings to block the work that they would do. And typically police would be called in and arrest students, or they would, another tactic would be inviting speakers and then kind of disrupting them. Political speakers typically, or disrupting speakers that the campus would invite over. There is a downside to the student protest movement. It gets more radical as the 60s goes on. In Madison, Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin, one student affiliated with the SDS blew up the math building, killing one person. So there was a dark side to these protests too. However, not everybody who opposed the Vietnam War were these new left radicals. Civil rights activists opposed the Vietnam War, most notably Dr. King. Dr. King, in the last year of his life, began to critique the Vietnam War heavily. He connected the issues of civil rights, poverty, and Vietnam, showing that they were all connected. That poor people were being sent to die in Vietnam, diverting money from the Great Society, while also diverting attention away from civil rights. And he began campaigning for this National Poor People's Campaign, which would redirect the attention that the government was giving to Vietnam towards the issue of poverty. Unfortunately, he was assassinated before he could carry that out. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War, founded by John Kerry, were also people who opposed the war. Walter Cronkite got people to oppose the war when he came out against it on national television. So it wasn't just these new left student protesters who were arguing against the war, but it was people from all walks of life within American society who opposed the Vietnam War also. Now, I want to spend some time on the year 1968 because that's where we see a lot of the themes and topics I've been talking about come to a head and crash and burn in a sense. So in January 1968, we see the Tet Offensive, which I talked about on Tuesday. And the Tet Offensive was a major offensive campaign by the North Vietnamese trying to end the war. It failed, but it showed just how far away America was from winning the war, and that increased anti-war activism at home. In March, so President Lyndon B. Johnson is already looking bad because of the war in Vietnam, and it looks especially bad because of the Tet Offensive. But he plans to be running for president again in 1968. However, in the first primary that year, unknown Minnesota senator from Minnesota, a unknown candidate essentially on the national level, Eugene McCarthy, nearly beats Johnson in New Hampshire, and he declared victory because even though he lost, because he wasn't expected. No one even heard about him before this campaign, and what other people saw when they saw McCarthy nearly beat Johnson was, oh, Johnson is vulnerable. If a nobody like McCarthy can almost beat Johnson, imagine what Robert Kennedy could do. So Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, joined the race for the Democratic primary. And this prompts Lyndon B. Johnson to drop out of the presidential race. So despite being one of the most effective politicians of his generation, and despite the successes of the Great Society, Vietnam ultimately ends Lyndon B. Johnson, and essentially there it ends Cold War liberalism, or at least not ends it, but it weakens it drastically. And the country's still recovering from this news that Johnson dropped out of the presidential race, and then it's hit with another, with more not bad news. It's hit with bad news when Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated on April 4th on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Riots break out at every major city across the country. The notable exception to that is Indianapolis, where Robert Kennedy was at the time, and when he heard the news that Kennedy was assassinated, he immediately got out of the restaurant he was eating at, where actually some people cheered, and he went to the black community and gave a impromptu speech on the back of a flatbed truck. And he actually was able to stop. The speech was so moving, it actually was able to prevent race riots in Indianapolis. Robert Kennedy represented the hope of the 1960s, and he was a little bit further to the left than Cold War liberalism, but of this progressive tide of the 60s. And this really comes to fruition and when he wins the California primary on June 5th. However, that same night, he is assassinated by a Palestinian radical named Sirhan Sirhan. And the country's just devastated. And he was the Democratic frontrunner, but despite that, the Democratic Party now no longer has no longer knows who to nominate. So the 1968 Democratic Convention is highly contested, and there were round after round of voting. But outside of the convention, there were protests in the street. The mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, actually declared martial law because of the protest, and there were police roaming the streets in armor, and they would beat up protesters sometimes. Now the protesters, they were holding the protests in Grant Park in Chicago, and they were mainly consistent of this one group called the Youth International Party, also known as Yippies. And they were known for doing these absurd protests against the Vietnam War, such as um, they did this pray at the Pentagon movement where they got over 1,000 people to pray at the Pentagon at one time to try to levitate it off the ground. It was absurd things like that. And the Youth International Party actually held its own national convention where it nominated a pig for president. His name was Pegasus. And it was a critique, though, of the Democratic Party because people would say, well, you're just voting for a pig, and they said, so are you. And these protests were on national media, and it made the Democratic Party look so broken, and just made the country seem so divided at this time. At the end of the Democratic National Convention, Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, comes away with the nomination, and he was very much a lackluster candidate. He was seen as Johnson light, and he didn't come out against the Vietnam War until the 2 weeks leading up to the campaign, and that really spelled his doom. But it was still a close election. He only lost by about 500,000 votes. Another notable aspect of the 1968 election is there was a third-party candidate, George Wallace, the segregationist governor from Alabama. He ran under a third-party platform, hoping to divide the vote. He was a populist essentially, and he was running on a platform of law and order. The country was tired of these race riots that had been going on. This is in Wallace's view. They were tired of the race riots going on. They were tired of the divisiveness, and the way to fix it was to increase policing. However, he did take an extreme view towards the Vietnam War. He saw that we were going to end the Vietnam War by escalating it even more, and his vice presidential candidate even suggested using nukes in the war. At the end of the day, Richard Nixon wins. He makes the stunning political comeback after losing to JFK in 1960, and he wins largely using the Southern strategy, which was that he tried courting the white voters of the South who were still angry about the civil rights movement, and he was trying to get them to switch parties, and this occurs throughout the 1970s and 80s and is finally finalized in the 1990s. He also uses Wallace's law and order rhetoric, which was a racial dog whistle intended to kind of feed on that white anger of the South. And he also tried to get the votes of the silent majority, this block of voters who existed, in his opinion, where they weren't the people who were speaking out against the Vietnam War, but there were these people who they were conservatives who were they didn't voice their opinion, so you couldn't actually tell that they were there, but they were the ones voting for him. But conservatives did speak out despite of Nixon's silent majority, and one of the issues that they spoke out the most against was the busing issue, one of the major civil rights initiatives of the 1960s and 70s. And it was busing essentially was that because neighborhoods were segregated, you would bus kids from different neighborhoods to go to different schools to make it more integrated. And middle class and upper class whites did, and poor whites too, did not like uh, this busing issue. In fact, um, people from all across the political landscape, including Democrats like Joe Biden, spoke out against busing. And even in northern cities, um, like Boston, mobs revolted against busing, famously. So it wasn't just the South attacking uh, segregation. It was the South wasn't the only area segregated. The whole country was, and busing uh, never really became that successful, and that's one of the main reasons why school systems, even though they're not segregated by law, they still are fairly segregated. Now, Nixon uses the Southern strategy and the silent majority tactics that he used in the 1968 election to win in a massive landslide in the 1972 election. However, that landslide victory was very short-lived, as just a couple days before the election, a couple of the arrests were made at the Watergate Hotel, where the Democratic National Convention was. I mean, not where the Democratic Party headquarters were, and that becomes the downfall of Richard Milhous Nixon. Now, the the part of the '60s that most people remember or identify with the '60s is the counterculture movement. Now, counterculture, broadly speaking, is a culture embracing values or lifestyles opposing those of the mainstream culture. So these weren't the Cold War liberals. But these also weren't the New Left. Now, maybe, of course, people of the counterculture opposed the Vietnam War, but they were much more interested in seeking personal and spiritual freedom and expression. They weren't too concerned about the wars that were happening. They were more concerned with liberating their mind. Now, the counterculture has its roots in the beat movement of the 1950s, but it spread out, and it became much more composed of white youth that were alienated by the culture of their parents, which they would call square. And they didn't want to have to deal with the conformity of Cold War liberals and the older generation. The first expressions of counterculture were in the folk music of the 1960s, such as Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger, but it transforms throughout the 1960s and it becomes much more, I guess, expressional. Bob Dylan, for instance, he goes electric and his music changes over the 60s. The Beatles' music changes over the 60s, and it largely changes with the increase of drugs and the types of drugs that they were using. The drug mostly associated with the 1960s is LSD or acid, and that played a heavy influence on the artwork that was being created and the music that was just being created. Major aspects of the counterculture were these music festivals that they would hold, where thousands of people would come in to these music festivals and just listen to music and vibe with each other. Vibe, as they would put it. And these music festivals live on to today, but this is where they first start. The first music festivals were known where the wasn't the Summer of Love in 1967, largely in San Francisco. You have the Monterey Pop Festival, which is near San Francisco, and that's where it was the first real big music festival, um, and it was organized by the Mamas and the Papas, one of the groups of the time. The song "California Dreamin'" was written about it. um, Also at Monterey Pop Festival, there are a number of acts who were discovered for the first time, including Otis Redding and Jimi Hendrix and The Who. In 1967, we see the largest pop musical festival, Woodstock, which just had its 50th anniversary last year. It is remembered uh, as 3 days of peace, love, and music. I believe it was over 1 million people gathered on a on a farm out in rural New York, and they just everyone just got along. That's kind of seen as the high water mark of counterculture. But also counterculture falls. It reaches its low point in 19 at the end of 1969 with the Altamont Music Festival, which is also near San Francisco. That Altamont was organized by the Rolling Stones, but it was organized poorly at a facility that didn't house that didn't have enough bathrooms for people. Uh, they also hired the Hells Angels as security, and the Hells Angels would attack bands while they were playing on the stage, and they even killed a person later at night. Also marking the end of the 1960s and the dark point of counterculture was the Manson family murders. Charles Manson, who died recently, was a cult figure of the Manson family, and he would get his cult members to murder people. Well, he got his cult members to murder Sharon Tate, and it was actually by accident. They were meant to murder one of the Beach Boys, who was in the Manson family but left. And this negative, the Manson family as well as Altamont really creates this negative stereotype of hippies, which in many ways lasts to today. The 60s are still very divisive, especially counterculture, because, well, it's either you love it or you hate it. However, the most successful moment of the 1960s, well, and the 1970s, is the fight for women's rights. Um, the women's rights movement of the 60s and 70s largely comes out of the New Left and civil rights movements, because many women in those organizations were angered that the men in the civil rights movement and the New Left movement would not pay attention to women's issues, and they also had they were sexist. Essentially, they relegated women to largely secretary jobs, and typically did not listen to anything that they would say. Uh, in the earlier part of the 60s, we labor feminism, uh, well, is successful. It's able to help get the passage of the Equal Pay Act, which established the principle of equal pay for equal work, which is still being fought for today. These labor feminists kind of kept the feminist movement alive in the 1950s and early 1960s by arguing for policies such as maternity leave and equal pay. Uh, Later on, well, not later on, around the same time that labor feminism is achieving many of its goals, Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique in 1963. and it largely spoke to college-educated middle-class white women who were stuck at home raising children. They were very disillusioned by the domesticity of the 1950s, and they were not really happy with their lives. Um, Friedan called it the problem without a name, and she gave it a name. And essentially, uh, what Friedan argues for, well, not argues for the feminist mystique creates this feminist movement where, such as it creates the National Organization for Women, which saw itself like the NAACP but for women, which it wanted to bring women into full participation in American society and give women equal rights. Now, different from now uh, are the women liberationists, or were also known as women's lib. Um, Women's liberationists also came out of out of the New Left and civil rights movements, but they were more radical than now. Now would typically try creating political coalitions with organizations. Women's liberation instead would protest, and they largely protested um, uh, sexism and male chauvinism, and they helped bring those two terms into national vocabulary. What they wanted really was to change how society viewed women. They uh, what happened was women needed more than equal opportunity. The what they needed was that the culture that regarded women as nothing more than sexual objects and helpmates to men, that had to change, and that's how they would attack it. Now, women's liberation was also divided along lines of lines of race, where black and Latino women would connect the issues of race with gender and uh, fight both at the same time. Organizations like the Combahee River Collective and the National Black Feminist Organization spoke for the concerns of black women who faced this double oppression of being both woman and black. Lastly, another successful aspect of the 1960s, or like the the protests of the 1960s, is gay liberation. So before the 1960s, it was essentially illegal to be gay. Uh, you couldn't, and also for that reason, protests were very limited because you couldn't be openly gay. So they were in the closet, so to speak. There were many sodomy statutes in states all across the country. Typically, you'd have police officers um, tricking men into kind of like police officers would try catching offenders by posing as a gay person to catch another person. Um, and also, homosexuality was considered a mental illness on top of being illegal. And many gay men were sent to um, mental institutions because they were gay. And many would even have to go under electric shock therapy. Now, the Stonewall riots in 1969 changes it changes the fight for gay rights. That's when gay activists started to really speak up. So, the Stonewall Inn, which was a local gay bar in Greenwich Village, which was considered kind of the gay district of New York, it was raided by cops, but the people in the Stonewall Inn revolted and rioted against the police for the next couple of days. In fact, they would chase the police around the blocks. It was a reversal of the roles that gay people were typically in, where they were chased by the cops, and that really started to spark organizations like the Manichetti Society to um, to organize really and to start and to get people to start coming out as gay and take pride in being gay. And the last two slides are really the successes of the 60s. So, despite being a decade of chaos and tumult, there were some positives. And, well, the fight for against poverty and for equal rights is still a long ways to go. Thank you and have a wonderful day.